Jane Flowers, long story, as of last night, or early this morning, I should say. And so I am a jazz musician turned computer programmer, turned fashion designer, turned whatever I'm doing right now, which I don't quite know yet, but I'm happy you're all here to explore with me. So yeah, that's probably my bio.
Cool. I'm Jane Pierce, and I have been doing alternative spirituality and psycho-spiritual healing since sometime in the 80s. And I have tried to find a new system about every 5 years because none of them had the answer. So here we go again, let's try. But what I started to notice is that they had their maps were similar in describing a very human terrain of what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. And so I want to share that overview with an understanding that we're going to jump back and forth between the labels that people put on the different stages. So in a nutshell, these are the stages. And some of them don't have normal and new normal as part of their steps, but it seems inherent that you have to have that. For me, if you don't, great. Know that I've got 6 stages because a lot of those other models will just have the 4 stages in between. So what I thought we would do is a real brief overview of those steps and then kind of dig into what they are. So I'm really only using these little bit of handout stuff for this 5-minute overview, if that's okay. And then I'm going to talk to you guys about it. Like, what's this experience? So normal seems obvious, but let's say a half a dozen other ways to describe it. This is what happened before the event, or if we're using the model, this is probably the eternal system that you're raised in, whether it's scientism or religion. It is how you think it is. This is just normal. And then something happens. So lots of different definitions of that normal. And then we get a precipitating event. And this, for some people, is traumatic, and for some people, wonderful. Again, it's a shamanic call in a system, or it's a peak experience, but it is something that shakes people out of whatever that normal or before was, either in a wonderfully positive way or not. As you'll see, the range of those options. What set you off? And then I would argue that this stage is the ordeal is the most common language for people to understand. It's a dark night of the soul for St. John of the Cross, but it is whatever that struggle is, and I would argue that it's nihilism. For as much as I understand the sense-making and eternal nihilism that we kind of learned last night. The Buddhists call it realm suffering, and the magicians call it being in the abyss. Swamped by trauma seems a more common phrase for it. And then they get a breakthrough, whether it's rising above or stream entry or something starts to shift. And they get to the other side of the abyss with a number of different languages. And then they integrate it. They unpack it. They adjust to it. This is sometimes a decade, sometimes 6 months. But this is, I think, the longest stage where you're trying to make sense of how you've lived. And I find that if people hit a bump in that last stage of breakthrough or in the integration stage, they sometimes bump themselves back. They re-traumatize and they're back at the precipitating event and digging through the ordeal. We'll get into those as a depth, but here's just some rough idea of it. And then the last one is a new normal. Plateau experience is a real common word for it, but it's like, okay, we're back to living our life. This new normal may make life much harder to live with or much easier to live with. We now have to accept that there's more nebulosity, would be another way to say it. We've got enough pattern in that integration stage, but we're now in this new normal. That was a really, really short overview. My goal being, let's talk about it. So I'll go back to the slide where we're looking at the different stages, maybe. is a list of stages, and now I want to talk about it. But maybe you'd share first, like, how's your experience with moving through these stages?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things when I saw these slides, the first thing that jumped to my mind is reading, there's a really good book by, I guess the movement these days, I've heard it called the Pragmatic Buddhist Movement, which is maybe a debatable name, I'm not sure they know much about that. But it's by a member of that kind of movement. And he lays out this very, 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 very particular stages and sub-stages of his particular way of the path. And it's very interesting, they're very fractal, they loop back in on each other and not. And so that's kind of the first thing that goes to my mind is that it's very interesting to see that a lot of individuals gravitate towards this very concrete structure for what seems like a very generative, into the abyss experience.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's kind of fascinating to see, is there still value in kind of trying to quantify per se, but add a bit more of a framework, or is it such an individual thing that there's never going to be a framework that you can kind of hew to, that you're always going to kind of be off on your own, whatever that means to you, because otherwise it wouldn't be the Dark Knight. You'd have to put a light here and there.
Right, exactly. You would have a schedule, and I have 3 more days of the Dark Night of the Soul, and then I'm done.
Yes, but the one other side of me that wonders is the commonalities here, because we see these across different religions, different, just kind of all different cultures. Maybe there is something that, whether it's in the structure of consciousness or maybe something a little wider band than just anything biological, that these stages are getting at, and so that maybe maps, whether they be fractal, whether they be very vague, are getting at something that's actually there and not something that's the inverse that a person has to explore of themselves. That's my 2 cents.
I think so. In that 4-step process you're talking about, they don't have normal and new normal. They're just using those 4 middle ones that roughly correspond. Anybody got experience with the Buddhists, the 4-step process where they're doing that? Okay, then there's no point in going into it. Or know that they also have it, maybe is the other way to say it. Well, before I go forward, is anyone making sense of this as these stages are looking at it? Does it look vaguely familiar to a system you've seen before, with or without the normal or the new normal in the end? One of the things that I've discovered in that process is that there are times that the precipitating event, the ordeal, and the breakthrough happen in very quick succession. So if you're doing an initiatory ritual, it is not uncommon to have the initiation, the ordeal, and the breakthrough on the other side. If that's what the process is looking like, my experience is that integrating gets really bleeping long. In other systems where I have done initiations and shamanic practices, they talk about what's called an initiatory crisis. And in those systems, I discovered that the ordeal process came either just before the initiation or just after, where there was an initiatory crisis. The just before was a fairly vague one. My experience, I did not expect the initiatory crisis to come before the initiation. That's not kind of how it's supposed to go in the system model. It happened for me that way because I had to postpone one of my initiations because I didn't want to finish initiation until I'd had a baby. And so I was like, thank you. And the acknowledgement, like, yeah, you're ready for the next initiation after you recover from the birth. And in that case, I felt I got the initiation after I'd given birth and recovered and experienced no initiatory crisis. And in conversations about it, they're like, so that really difficult birth you had where you kind of almost bled out? We kind of think that was your initiatory crisis. And by postponing the initiation, you flipped a little of the order.
I was going to say pregnancy and childbirth is always an initiatory ordeal. Well, maybe not the first one. When a woman has her first child, that is an initiatory ideal that literally transforms her from maiden to mother.
Yes.
And it goes through those processes. Precipitating event is getting pregnant, right? the ordeal is partly the pregnancy, but especially the actual childbirth. The breakthrough is it's all over. You get flooded with endorphins. You hold baby, you get flooded with oxytocin, and that's your breakthrough. And then in the ensuing weeks and months, you formulate this new identity. Like, I am a mother now. This person is dependent on me, and I have to like reconcile how I feel about that. And you have a lot of I think this works with like initiatory ordeals as well, because you're getting more into an in-group, and you have conflict then with wider society, and with like childbirth. What I've observed a number of times is that a mother is afraid to acknowledge her feelings of what the hell is this thing? What did I get myself into? Sometimes I want to throw this out the window because all of society is saying, this is supposed to be the best time of your life, and oh, you have nothing but love for this little being. And sometimes you want to throw it out the fucking window, right?
Yeah.
And you have to reconcile, like, my identity as a mother is like really fighting with my identity as who I was without being a mother, and there has to be some and I think you can also dance back and forth across these. I don't think this is always a clear, dry path, right? Because there are times that you can get to breakthrough, you can backpedal a little bit into the ordealness of it, and that's part of the integration process.
I think so too. I think integration is an up and down and a long process. I think there are some times that there is enough re-traumatization that you wind up bucked back. Let's say postpartum depression in that example, and all of a sudden you're back in ordeal. Something breaks, literally you break something physically in yourself. I think the value in the model is the understanding that the ordeal and the breakthrough, and then it's not over. The integration is unknown length and a very mixed bag of I love it, I hate it, I see the pattern, fuck, I lost it again. And for me, the reason I started using this model was I was seeing people having just those three: initiation, ordeal, and breakthrough. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Are you ever going to unpack this? Are you ever going to change your life because of what happened? And I don't know if, what I'm curious about is, how have you guys had that? How have you had that initiatory, or whether it's becoming mother or taking on, I graduated, whatever new identity in our lives, graduation ceremonies, or maybe it's finals, is oh my gosh, I'm done. And then what happens?
So I became a father, and I think for me, the new normal just seemed automatic. I mean, I think there were brain chemistry changes. It's like my priorities just automatically shifted. Like, yep, the child, that's number one. There's no resentment. Now there was an integrating, lack of sleep, a period with not getting enough sleep, which I think was maybe part of that integrating.
Or ordeal,
depending upon where that fit. So that was one, not as, I don't know, dramatic or traumatic as the Dark Night of the Soul or anything like that. But there was a change, a new, old normal and new normal.
You had any experience with that?
Yeah, I've had, I was going through some stuff with my family, and I generally did not get along with them, and something kind of broke through, and I made up with my father, who, yeah, he was a real asshole in my youth, but yeah, we made up, and I kind of went through a spiral where, I mean, things got better, but there was like periods where I just completely lost my ability to make sense of things. Like, I started to question, like, it sounds so embarrassing to admit, but like the weird stuff, like what is time, or what am I, like, question my identity, and things just didn't really make a lot of sense, and they still don't quite make a lot of sense. And I remember there's one day where like I had this like breakthrough, like, oh, I could see really clearly myself and my patterns, and in that day I just acted way differently. I could see, oh, these are things that are holding me back in certain ways, and I became a lot more open, and carrying my friends were like, whoa, what's happening? But then it just quickly faded because I had no infrastructure to support that change, and I felt like if I believed that I could do that, it would have led to weird things. I don't know. I had a weird.
It would have shaken your entire world.
Yeah, and I feel kind of guilty about not pushing further with that, but I feel like a lot of this requires infrastructure. It needs a community of people who recognize the new you that you're trying to make, and if you don't have that, it's kind of like what's going on. Like, although there are certainly people who are able to do that by themselves, but it's more risky.
I think it is more risky. I don't think there's a judgment on whether or not you are sequentially going through. Because what it sounds like to me is that you got your breakthrough. We're integrated it for a day and didn't have the support to stay in integration. When you felt like you lost it, was there still that awareness on the other side that like it's possible, I just can't do it right now?
Yeah, it feels quite sad. I don't know if I'll ever get to that point. And there was a point where I was like, oh, I'm gonna meditate my way to this space, but I don't. I have that awareness.
That to me is one of the differences in that process, that when in the ordeal, the nihilism is really like, what's the point? There's no hope, there's no point, I've lost. The breakthrough lets you kind of see the light. And even if you're falling back or feeling you're back in the ordeal, you might actually be in integration by like, oh, now how do I live there? Right? I know something's better, but integrating, at least to me, is that process of figuring out how to sustain it, finding the support network so you can keep doing it. It's not a fail, although there's certainly, I don't want to argue that there isn't re-traumatization that truly puts people back into ordeal. But one of the things I discovered is that integration processes after the breakthrough, want it all to be pretty. And in an example of parenthood, it is not. There's some sleepless, ugly nights that don't feel good, that take years. And you feel like, I have the questions, but I ain't got the answers.
I think it's amazing that you brought up the support structure concept, because that's instrumental in like forming a new identity, which is key to any kind of personal change, is adopting a new identity. But if everyone around you is just seeing you the old way, it's like so much weight to push against. But like Jesus even said in the Bible, prophets are without power in their own country, because you go forth as like, I'm a disciple of Jesus and I have all these, I can show you miracles and teach you all these wisdoms and stuff. You go back home, where Prophet Daniel was just little Danny, and nobody will listen to what he has to say because they just see little Danny, right? It's the same with any kind of like, you can have this epiphany, you can have this breakthrough, and realize the shifts that you've made and the shifts that you're continuing to make and adopting and embracing those, but then going out and everybody's still seeing you as little Danny is like so hard to work against, right? And like Timothy Leary talked about that with like psychedelic experiences. You can have this like epiphany of like understanding implicitly the interconnectedness of all life and realizing that you're just as much God as everyone else. And then you come down and now like somebody has to take out the trash. And you have to integrate the idea that God can also take out the trash. There's all these little the bits and pieces of your old life are still there, kind of like as a friction against that integration.
I think very much so. Why I think we get this language, whether it was structures in Buddhism, in ceremonial magic with crossing the abyss, with a number of, to whatever degree, religious or spiritual systems, is that they get that you have to have a support community on the other side. And when we have these precipitating events like motherhood, you may or may not have the support system to keep going, or fatherhood. And so what I'm hoping for is that we can use these more spiritual historical models to find a way to identify that what's missing is a support structure. What's missing in that integration stage is something that helps us make sense of it and keep going.
Could I ask a
Yeah.
question about you? Like when you were going through like these periods, like if you could go back and talk to your like past self, like do you think there could have been something that you could have added that would have made the transition easier? Like, is there anything you could have told yourself that could have helped them?
I mean, in my case, I really think your kind of comment about infrastructure is a really foundational point, actually, and that's knowing what infrastructure, knowing what soil you need to be planted in, ends up being a lot of the game, and it's very difficult because a lot of times it kind of reminds me of the Buddhist jhanas. One of the kind of sayings is you never enter the jhanas directly; you only create conditions so that they may arise. And so it's this kind of process almost. I've liked the metaphor recently of moving sideways, in kind of a way that because if you knew how to move forward, you would have already done it. There wouldn't be a problem. It would just be daily life. You would either have infrastructure that makes you flow in that direction. Your kind of life current would be flowing that way already. So it's this kind of idea of shit, now I've got to move sideways. I'm not shaped for this. I'm not trained for this. And that's figuring out how do you get these environments to kind of reflect back where you need to step next. It's very much outside your path, very much outside your nature. Is this kind of very artful kind of practice. And that's what I would probably communicate to myself overall is that this very much kind of walking sideways process of how do I constantly just wiggle my environment a little more to get a little different perspective, a little different view. It's very visual for me to almost kind of a profound degree. And so that's what I would tell myself is that this kind of process of mirroring, of not so much self-mirroring, but enabling yourself to be mirrored in different ways. I would say that would probably be the foundational thing that I was missing a lot of the time when I was doing earlier loops through the earlier stages.
I like that a lot. If I could go back and say something, I would say this ain't the only one, which is not supposed to be comforting, but it takes some of the pressure off of it. So one of the times that I went through a dark night of the soul, I had a near-death experience. I had an unplanned pregnancy in college, and I started making adjustments to change my entire life. My brother's like, stay home and live with mom and dad for a couple of years. And when I graduate, you can come live, and like literally I'm restructuring my life to make this all happen. And I had a miscarriage. And so I almost died in the miscarriage. And I reach out for the great mother or somebody. And I sense what I think is a deity there. And she says, come see, come saw. Babies live, babies die. Mothers live, mothers die. I'll be here either way. Like fucking shit. And that well, okay, cool. There is a God. I really did reach out and God was there. And she doesn't care. Which I don't think was what she was saying. She was saying, yes, you've miscarried and it's okay. That happens. That living and dying isn't in the definition of the gods. So whichever one you do, that's okay. I'll be here. But I didn't hear that's okay part. I was just like, whatever. And so there was a real sense of I've changed my entire life. I've everything about me, including my health, now is at risk. And I did make really great changes. I left engineering and went into education, which I don't know that I could have survived working at GM anymore. So I don't think that it's wrong that I did all of that. But if I would have known then, this is just one of the times you're going to do that. And the next time I did that, I do mean I then, even when I had an unplanned pregnancy, I had a very sporting family. We're all going to do this. This is about baby. So you could not have paid me money that I would have ever made any choice that I would be pregnant and alone. But when I found out I was pregnant with my fourth child, my husband said, so I'll be working in Toronto for the rest of the year. I was like, oh, what you are? You at least have to be here for the birth, asshole. But I found myself then raising 3 children, pregnant, and trying to do it alone. And I, in my not infinite wisdom, had entered advanced initiatory practice where I was taking on shadow work. And my definition of shadow work is when the universe puts you in a place that you have made every rational effort not to be. I don't think accepting your anger is shadow work. I understand that Jung describes it that way, and I'm not arguing with his language. It's just this kind of abyss, dark night of the soul is I really did everything. I didn't get a divorce. He didn't lose his job. They just sent him to Toronto, and I had to choose to go be alone in a little condo in Toronto with 3 children pregnant, or to be in Metro Detroit by myself. There's no answer. And I think if I had known either of those times, it's clear. I knew it better the second time. Let me correct that. I'd been through enough initiations. I knew this. I was like, oh, we're doing this again. And I might feel like I'm going to lose my whole life, and I'm going to have to totally change my identity again. Not that there's not an ordeal, not that there's not chaos and a long time of reintegrating, but we make it so big. And I think that if you keep doing your work, you're going to come to a point where you're going to have to flip the table again, and it all goes to hell, and I have to put the pieces back together. And I know people who've never had that. And I think they live small, boring lives, at least from the outside. And I'm not saying that everything goes their way, but they've never faced an identity crisis. In the sense making, they've never had to go, they just stayed in eternalism in a small enough way that they never felt like the eternalism didn't fit. They're like, that's okay, I'm going to keep rationalizing, I'll disassociate, drink a little more, and you'll be there. So for me, this is an inevitability of people who are living full out, go big or stay home. I don't know. Like, that's not, I don't think any of us go looking for that often. I certainly didn't expect it to rock my world. I'd had tons of initiations. I didn't, and I'd had tons of babies by that point. I didn't expect my 4th pregnancy to be this radically different. And I certainly didn't expect for power to go out from Toronto through Detroit on one August weekend, so that I am there with 3 puking children in preterm labor, and my husband is somewhere between Toronto and Detroit, where there's no power and no gas stations, and like that's that absurdity. But I think that's part of it. Is there is an absurdity. There is like, this is fucking hilarious, because if I wrote this story, you wouldn't believe it. The sitcoms wouldn't play it. And when you take that, like, oh, this is fucking crazy, we're gonna do it again. You don't have to get it right, just get a version.
In one way, it's kind of thinking about how do you learn, how does kind of nature, how does life kind of tell you that adaptation isn't the only way. Because for me, at least, a lot of times when I think I shouldn't be suffering this sort of thing, I shouldn't be without power with 3 kids.
Right? That's not
on the flip
fair.
side of it is the idea that I should be more adapted to where this doesn't happen to me. And that's such a crazy assumption once you dig down deeper into it. What basis do you have that on, that I should always be well adapted to my environment? And the other question is, and one of the things that I think that this kind of process is really good at with regards to adaptation is that it kind of puts cracks in the idea that adapting to your environment, to your point, will make you very, very small. And the more you adapt to your environment, they're never mutually exclusive. That's one of the hard navigating things. Is where do you draw the line each time? But how much have you adapted to your environment versus how much have you adapted to yourself?
Yeah.
And again, it's the dual. I don't want to set up duality there, because that almost immediately dissolves upon further interrogation. But that's one kind of starting point for me, is thinking about adaptation versus something else that's not adaptation, that life still goes on.
Yes.
So.
Or maybe arguably you can't have an initiation without going through these stages. That when we do performative initiations, these stages don't happen. But graduate from high school is an initiation, and there is these stages. Have a baby, and there is these stages. All the initiatory, I am truly crossing a line, like I'm done with high school, or whatever that, I'm a parent, whatever those lines are, anytime you do that, authentically and fully, then you're going to get to some degree.
How do you balance all this while being responsible for other people?
That's been challenging. I think, honestly, that wasn't the hardest part for me.
Really?
Yeah, that's not good. Let me be clear. That's not good. I think that my trauma package coming into this is to be the responsible one. You know, like one of my first experiences with that was like, give me the baby. I'll make him stop crying. And my mother handed the baby over to me and I made him stop crying. And if anyone ever handed my newborn to a 6-year-old, I would kick their fucking ass. But it occurred to nobody in the house that that was a bad idea. My father had just been in a motorcycle accident and he had a broken arm. And so she was like, I have to go to the bathroom. And handed the baby over to somebody with 2 working arms. I mean, arguably, no, I don't think healthily, but because I had that since 6 then, it didn't occur to me that it was hard to take care of somebody else and do that. It challenged me to how I was going to do it. And it required a lot of shifting. I think if I hadn't had a lot of therapy before I had a full term life pregnancy, then I might have been in more trouble, because that first miscarriage then precipitated some therapy that allowed me tools to be like, I'm going to do this. And now I'm not. So I've had people make fun of me. Did you just schedule a breakdown? I was like, yeah. I want to have a sobbing mess if you haven't peed first. I could tell I was getting triggered. And in that same way, I could say, and we don't have flashbacks while we drive. So, good therapist who can stop me from having, who gave me enough tools to not have a flashback so that I could drive. Now that might mean I have to have tools in the car. Eating helps me stop flashbacks, you know, so I would, I'm starting to trigger, let's get in the body. Piece of gum will embody me more than get me out of disassociating. So a lot of skills. But I don't think you do it perfect. I think maybe that's even one of the hardest parts of it. I don't know how old you guys' kids are, but I have no kids living at home with me, and so I've had the experience now repeatedly of children coming back to me who are getting healthier and saying, I need to talk to you about the choices you made. I really don't like what you did. And I have to take a deep breath. I'm like, okay, let's have this conversation. Well, I'm autistic and I'm ADHD and you didn't. I was like, I did not put those labels on you and I did not drug you. You were right. Now let's talk about why you made that choice. Was it right? Fuck if I know. My kid doesn't think it's right. But when I was doing it 20 some years ago, you couldn't get scholarships. You couldn't join the army. You literally couldn't do all these different things if either of those labels had been put on my kid. I was like, oh, you might be on the spectrum. Guess we're homeschooling. Until you level out, and then they went to high school and they were fairly functional and I gave them the tools. Doesn't mean I did a good job. Ask my kids. Doesn't mean I did a horrible job either. Does that help?
No, it does.
Okay, because I was like, I think I did a good job of taking care of them, but I don't let my kids speak to me, so I guess I'm doing good there.
It's cool for you to invite feedback, even if it's unwelcome.
Oh, it's hard.
Yeah.
I have one kid who doesn't live in the state. It was really hard for me to have a child move out of state. I, at this point, think it's the best thing they could have done. Partly because they went and worked for Epic and MyChart, and that was a really good job to have during the pandemic. But also because they transitioned, and I think they left the state and had their transition easier than they could have had it here with all of us. When you talk about the support system, sometimes leaving your support system is easier. My kid would come back and they'd be using they as pronouns, and then they'd go back to Wisconsin and they'd say, I'm only accepting she. I was like, and here I'm feeling like, but I had the answer and you changed the question on me? And the answer is yeah, because I think they went back to Wisconsin. And without the the external community of support, the new self, the more authentic self, came through. I don't know how your process of that experiences with support groups or not support groups, because
Yeah, a lot of my biggest kind of transitions in life, I've been very alone, and that was kind of the template that was handed down to me. And that's why I kind of speak to the importance of mirroring or infrastructure or whatever you want to call it. I think they're all pointing to the same thing. Because in a sense, I very much didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't realize until 10 years later that I got booted off the fucking Christmas card when it came out. I didn't even think about it. That's how deeply embedded the prophet not recognized in his own hometown. I was drinking that Kool-Aid myself in a way. It took me a very long time to get out and kind of realize that in a way I'm still working on that. So yeah, I don't remember what the question was initially, but
how was the support systems easier? Because I think my kid did better. Not that they didn't at some level create a support system, but not really well. Moved to another state in the middle of the pandemic, work from home. What kind of support system did they have?
Do you both feel like you have like a more or less comfortable communities to like work around, work with them, the support system?
I say for me it's still very much a work in progress. And I think one of my kind of key things in terms of that would you could probably define a lot of my stages in terms of a particular blindness around the kind of community mirroring and thinking very much as a self-sustaining lineageless kind of person. And so in a way I've had to kind of navigate what does that mean for me. It's almost kind of a color blindness in a way. Navigating the world in that way and slowly learning to see color again, slowly kind of relying on synesthesia to kind of triangulate what do other people see as colors, and slowly being able to see colors myself past a certain point after doing all this kind of foundation. I would say, yeah, that's kind of been my process.
I have a very small and good support system now, but I lost 90% of it in a couple of years before the pandemic. I was very active in a very large community, and I was leaning back in to get more involved. Oh, my kids getting older, I had done it with kids, and I'd kind of taken a back seat when they were in high school, and I was like, oh, there's a way too much of that many kids in high school for me to be fully in. So I was getting easier in my life, and I wanted to volunteer more, and I did not belong back there. Would be one way of describing it. And people went after me and called CPS on me to drive me out would be the other way to describe it. I think it was a huge favor they did me. I think that if I had tried to be in that community through the pandemic, I would have done damage to myself and trying to be external and communicative. But I lost that community in 18 and found like my community shrinking and shrinking. And then the pandemic happened, and I was like, oh, we all lost our community. Now let's figure out what's next. And I did get another initiation at that time and kicked back in. Because one of the cool things is if you're really lost, getting initiated, for me at least, gives the impetus to then go through the ordeal and the breakthrough again. I would always recommend doing it the way I do it, because I'm a little bit intense. A little adrenaline junkie sometimes.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to share some of their own experiences with that? I loved what you said about fatherhood.
I don't think I've had large, dark nights of the soul or anything like that. I've had experiences that were frightening that I fought my way out of. I guess I was solo backpacking in Maryland and made some mistakes that now I can say, don't do it this various ways, these various things that I did. But one of those was, was the circle route. I had a book. This is back before GPS or anything, but I had a book. I had a topo map, and it said, oh, here's a nice circle route you can do. You go down the Appalachian Trail, you cut over, you come up this trail. Well, this other trail, it was fine at first, but then it was like brambles and briars, and it was not well, but it was just a mess. Like, it had not been maintained. But I got through that. I was like, oh, okay. And then I climb up this hill, and okay, I'm going to stop here for the night. But then I couldn't get back down. Like, I could not find the trail back down. And so I had a map, and I knew there was a road. And I was like, well, I just head down this way because I know the road's there. That's my plan B. But then there's a cliff. I can't go down. And then I'm starting to panic.
Mm-hmm.
And I stopped, and I don't know what I did, but I contained the panic or whatever. I think I just paused. And then I was able to look at the map and say, oh, if I look at the lines in the topographic map, if I just follow them around, and I had a compass, and until, downhill is south, that will get me to this road. So I was able to think my way out of it, but I think there was a moment, I don't think that subsequently had, integration or whatever, but that was a moment of panic and maybe letting go, not letting go of the mental part of me that was.
The controlling part.
Yeah.
And discovering that you had resources rather than control.
Yeah, that I could then see another way.
I would argue that that's a big part of any of that process, is a surrender of control that leads to a discovery of what do you do when it's not the way you think it's going to be, when are you not, divine plan order, challenge of eternalism in one of those languages. Then what happens? Can you find a pattern? Can you live with uncertainty?
Do you see the new normals as being more complex than the old normals? Is it greater complexity that contains the older viewpoint?
Sometimes. I think that sometimes when it's very trauma-based, it is a simpler new normal because you're like, oh, I'm throwing out that trauma. I've contrived to keep myself as a result of this trauma. So yes, for the most part, except when there's a difference between a spiritual and a trauma-based process. And that trauma-based process is really inherent in the shamanic system. They talk a lot about the wounded healer, and that if you're whole, you can't help, you can't lead people. You have to have been broken and recovered in order to do that work. Not that good luck good for people who are whole. And I think some of us are more sensitive to the ordeal and the integration than others.
This is especially true in the recovery community where people who do not have their own personal story of addiction and recovery have a very difficult time succeeding as a counselor or a facilitator because they don't have any cred. Mm-hmm. And people in that situation specifically are you can't possibly understand what I'm going through unless you did it right or wrong. That is mm-hmm. definitely a collective kind of common perception in those communities that the leaders have to have done it themselves or that they don't have any credibility.
Mm-hmm. So I agree. I think there's an awful lot of codependent people who have a different crash and burn and rise again process, but it's not their own addiction. And they're not seen as authorities in that community. It's not the pleasantest of topics. I do want to say that I find myself laughing a lot or making light of, in some ways, because you reach a point where you're like, this is really? And then this is fucking comical because how can the power go out everywhere from here to Toronto? And it did. And that child was born eventually, and he's 20, and we'll be fine. But if you haven't had that, it is in that intensity of the experience, I think, that it starts, that I think the laughing is a big part of it. The comicalness of the nihilism. of really? And actually, that's where I find myself getting out of the ordeal. And I'm like, kidding me? Like, of course, this is what we're gonna do.
In 2020, early in lockdown, my elder daughter broke her leg on the trampoline. It was like probably 3 days into lockdown. She broke her leg, full cast from the hip to the ankle. And we had just ordered a bunch of lawn toys because we're going to be stuck at home for 3 to 9 months. We've got to have some things for the kids to do around here. We got like one of those geodesic dome climbing things, which arrived the day after she broke her leg. And we're like, well, we'll still set it up because the younger daughter can climb on it and she can, we can put up a hammock, she can like still hang out there. And the moment we set up the climbing thing, my younger daughter was climbing up and she was hanging and she was literally this far off the ground. She let go and we heard a click. And she broke her leg. So in the first week of lockdown in 2020, I had both of my children in leg casts. And when the second one happened, she dropped. Like this is after. So my elder daughter had cancer in 2019, and so then when pandemic, people say 2020 was the worst year ever. 2020 was not the worst year ever. 2020 was a relief to us because we're like, okay, we don't have to do anything except just be a family at home. This is great, right? But lockdown happened, the pandemic lockdown. First daughter breaks her leg. When our second daughter dropped, and we heard a click, and me and my wife just both looked at each other and just started laughing because what the fuck else can go wrong? This is absurd.
Yes, it is the absurdity of it. I think that, and in that laughter, you can't laugh and be in control. Not real laughter. You can laugh at somebody, ha ha ha, but like the real deep laughter, I think, is inherent in the lack of control and the absurdity of life. And
Well, isn't humor one of the 6 textures of the complete stance?
we're about to get told we're done. I want to know if anybody's got a last question or a last thought they'd like to share. For us or posterity, I don't know how that video's gonna go. Some story. Oh, wait a minute, I was on tape for that.
I'll just say the comment you made, you don't have control, you have resources. That has stuck with me and been resonating for the last 20 minutes or so. So that was really good.
I like the line that you said about how you had to go sideways, and it connected with Bruce's story a bit about using like.
Yes,
Go sideways, yeah.
And,
That's true. Yeah, I did have this. My initial, I gotta go this now. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys for giving us the answers. We won't have it out nights anymore.
There are no doubts now.
All night nights from now on.
Easy peasy.
It is a real book.
I think at some point this slide's gonna be around, so.